In 1890, in the settlement of Cheyenne, Oklahoma, a young woman carried out her daily tasks among corrals and dirt roads. During that Old West period, the community lived off livestock farming and small general stores. The first rail lines were beginning to reduce rural isolation. Steamboat was a black stallion, born around 1901 near Chugwater, known on the rodeo circuit for his strength in throwing off riders. In 1909, his silhouette was adopted as the state's official emblem. Since 1936, it has appeared on Wyoming license plates, evoking the heritage of local cowboys. In 1888, an itinerant photographer captured Lily Mae Smith Tucker, a descendant of the Cherokee Nation and daughter of Nimrod Jarrett Smith, a community figure in the Indian Territory. The glass plate, produced with the wet collodion technique, reveals her features and hints of a culture in transition under Western influences. Calamity Jane appears in this photograph taken at Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood, at the end of July 1903, next to the tomb of Wild Bill Hickok, a companion on expeditions. On August 1st, she died in Terry, a nearby settlement, and following her own request was buried beside Hickok, reinforcing the association between their names. Marcia Paschal descends from Lieutenant Colonel George W. Paschal and Cherokee forebears, blending a 19th century military tradition with her indigenous heritage. While the officers' deeds were recorded in campaign reports and official decorations, Cherokee culture appears in ceremonies, language, and oral narratives that Marcia researches through genealogical archives and tribal records. A Paiute hunter from the Uinta Nation, photographed around 1873 in southwestern Utah, holds up the rifle acquired through trade networks with Mormon settlers, reflecting the indigenous adaptation to firearms during the expansion of the American frontier on the Colorado Plateau. Eureka, Colorado, around 1900. In the Animas River Valley, the small mining camp appears among the San Juan Cliffs, with wooden shacks, ore piles, and the narrow-gauge Denver and Rio Grande line that brought supplies and carried out silver and zinc. After the Panic of 1893, only a few dozen residents remained, but the chimneys still smoked, proof of ongoing work despite the winter isolation. In 1898, photographer Frank Reinhardt captured Hattie Tom, a woman of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, during the Indian Congress in Omaha. The photograph documents not only her face and traditional clothing, beaded necklaces and a fringed leather outfit, but also suggests ceremonial practices and communal bonds within this group. This visual record enriches the study of Chiricahua social structures, rituals, and cultural exchanges at the end of the 19th century. Chief Joseph, Hinmatu Yalat Kekt, led the Nez Perce in the 1877 war, seeking to take his people to Canada to escape U.S. removal policies. The photograph, circa 1880, was taken after his surrender and exile. That year, Joseph was in Washington, where he spoke before authorities and reporters in defense of returning to the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. Dated to around 1890, this photograph of a young Lakota woman records a moment of cultural transition on the Great Plains. She appears wearing traditional ornaments and garments, while background details suggest changes imposed by outside contact. This visual document illustrates ritual practices, ways of life, and everyday artifacts, providing material for historical studies of her group's heritage and social relations. At the turn of the 20th century in Castle Dale, Utah, local men gather in a wooden saloon, mugs of beer in hand, while a horse, possibly one of their mounts, stands calmly beside the counter. The scene illustrates social habits in the Mormon backcountry and the informality of Western bars before Prohibition. Alice was born around 1900 in territory that today corresponds to the northwestern United States. Official records are scarce and oral traditions do not specify her tribal origin, but they indicate a possible link with the Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla nations. This uncertainty in the documents suggests that her practices and family ties derive from one of these indigenous communities of the region. This photograph portrays a young woman of undocumented identity and origins, positioned before bowls whose purpose remains unknown. Made by photographer Adam Clark Vroman around 1860, the image uses the platinum print process, prized at the time for its stability and tonal range, and reflects 19th century documentary practices. Sawatanuk, born in the late 19th century, was living in 1914 as an active member of the Kwakwaka'wakw on the northwest coast of Vancouver. Her community inhabited cedar communal houses and organized itself around the salmon fishing and deer hunting seasons. She took part in potlatches that governed exchanges, alliances, and social offices. Her daily life followed ancestral traditions passed down orally. Thatlo Harjo was born in 1791 and fought in the Seminole Wars of 1817 and 1835. In 1842, after defeat, he was moved to Indian Territory. In 1861, he enlisted in the 1st Indian Home Guard Regiment, serving the Union. The image shows his uniform and tribal ornaments. After the war, he settled in what would become Seminole County, Oklahoma, and died in 1904 at 113 years old. Around 1900, a young member of one of the many Native American tribes was documented in a studio photograph. This early 20th century visual record reveals not only her face, but also suggests aspects of traditional dress, daily practices, and the social dynamics of her indigenous community. In 1913, 2 members of the Navajo Nation stand on the edge of Canyon de Chelly, Arizona, looking at the walls of the ancient White House ruins, remains of ancestral Pueblo settlements dating to the 13th century. The scene highlights the cultural continuity of the dine after the long walk, and the scope of federal photographic mapping efforts in the Southwest. Julie Nelson was born in 1886 on land belonging to her indigenous nation, characterized by plains and waterways. She belonged to a community guided by tribal leaders and seasonal ceremonies. Like her compatriots, she was dedicated to hunting, cultivation, and the oral preservation of knowledge about the land. A company of armed citizens gathered in Yuma, Arizona in 1895, when the territory still sought institutional stability. The scene shows local farmers and county officers after they were sworn in to patrol the border and curb cattle theft, reflecting the social tensions that marked the Old West in the post-Civil War period. Inusk, grandson of the Kickapoo leader who mediated relations with other tribes, begins to appear in oral accounts recorded in the late 1880s. His presence symbolizes the transmission of rituals, ceremonial practices, and the internal council's decisions of the Kickapoo tribe. Thus, Inusk plays a decisive role in preserving historical heritage and consolidating the collective identity of this indigenous people. In 1900, Apache women regarded basketry as a cornerstone of their material culture. They used grass straw, reeds, sweetgrass, and cedar strips, preparing and dyeing them with oils extracted from seeds. Each basket, whether for storage or ceremonies, was woven in geometric and symbolic patterns, the result of techniques and knowledge passed down through generations, demonstrating the central role of weaving in community life. Then a cadet at the West Point Military Academy, George A. Custer appears around 1859 wielding a Colt 1855 sidehammer pocket revolver, a personal weapon commonly used by officers on the eve of the Civil War. 17 years later, he would lead the 7th Cavalry in the Great Plains Campaign and fall at Little Bighorn in 1876. In 1910, the depiction of an Arapaho woman documents the continued presence of this tribe on the Great Plains of North America. Wearing a leather dress adorned with geometric patterns and beads, signs of affiliation and status, she illustrated ceremonial practices and the transmission of traditional knowledge in a context of political change. Photo taken around 1870 in the New Mexico Territory, when cattle theft was widespread on the vast frontier ranches. The scene shows armed cowboys guarding a recently recovered herd, illustrating the tensions between Hispanic ranchers and Anglo-American settlers under still uncertain territorial laws after the Civil War. Minnie Lou Ottinger Bradley emerges at the beginning of the 20th century amid profound transformations in the United States. She witnessed rapid industrial expansion, the women's suffrage movement, labor organization, and the debates over prohibition. Her testimony offers a detailed view of the social, political, and cultural changes of that turning point. Interior of the Jackson Bar in the mining town of Idaho City, around 1895. A pine counter, imported mirrors, and rows of whiskey bottles, with miners and travelers taking a break after their workdays in the gold fields that drove the local economy of what was then the Idaho Territory. In 1909 in White Cloud, Kansas, a photograph captures Nora Barada Murphy, an Iowa woman then residing in that community. The daughter of generations whose presence stretches across Kansas and Nebraska since the 19th century, she appears in traditional attire, beaded necklaces, leather fringes, and printed fabrics. The portrait documents not only her clothing but also the marks of her cultural identity, visible in her features and bearing. An image of the veteran Rocky Mountains explorer Jim Bridger, taken around 1876, when the famed hunter and guide was living his final years. The photo shows one of the last mountain men, a generation that, from 1820 to 1840, opened trade routes, described passages like the South Pass, and served as a link among fur trappers, the military, and various indigenous nations of the American West. The 1923 photograph of Ada Lopez Richards documents daily life among the Tolowa in the early 20th century. From the coastal villages between California and southern Oregon, Ada was instrumental in collecting songs and oral narratives, as well as teaching the traditional basketry techniques that sustained her community. The Crystal Palace Saloon, built on Allen Street after the Great Fire of 1882, appears around 1885, when Tombstone was sustained by a silver rush. Frequented by newly paid miners, professional gamblers, and law officers, the saloon was an essential meeting place to negotiate, drink, and keep up with the news coming into the rapidly changing territory. In 1910, Anna Cask Cash conveyed Cayu's tradition to observers by wearing her ceremonial attire, assembled with skins, glass beads, leather fringes, and scraps of commercial cotton that reflected agricultural cycles and rites maintained by the tribe since time immemorial. At that time, these practices faced pressure from assimilation policies and the rapid spread of Western values and customs. Studio photo from 1888, showing 4 Apache scouts in service to the United States Army during the final stages of the Apache Wars. They wear a mix of military clothing and tribal elements, illustrating the role of these indigenous individuals as guides and trackers in operations against groups led by Geronimo in southern Arizona. Dated 1908, the photograph documents a young woman of the Sioux tribe, a Native American people of the Great Plains. Captured on a glass plate, she wears bison hides, feather adornments, and rows of glass beads. The image serves as a record of Sioux identity practices at the start of the 20th century. In 1922, already 62 years old, Annie Oakley displays her marksmanship during a public demonstration in the United States. The performance crowned 4 decades of fame obtained in Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, a symbol of an era in which women's shooting sports gained visibility. In the autumn of 1939, during a federal government ethnographic survey, a photographer captured June Welch, a 16-year-old Cherokee girl in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Her cotton dress and beaded necklace reproduced patterns handed down for generations. The photograph documents ritual practices and collective memories. In 1885, Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader, had already left exile in Canada and surrendered to the United States Army. Held as a prisoner at Fort Randall, he was later transferred to the Standing Rock Reservation. That same year, he agreed to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, receiving a regular salary to travel through American cities and perform for audiences interested in the recent Indian Wars. In 1886, Lina Geronimo was born within the walls of Fort Marion, today called Castillo de San Marcos, on the Florida coast, where her father, the Apache chief Geronimo, was held as a prisoner of war by the United States Army. This context of captivity marks the beginning of her life and imbues her trajectory with profound historical symbolism. A 1914 photo shows two Navajo men on horseback, in the shadow of Shiprock, a sacred formation for the Dine and a landmark in northwestern New Mexico. The scene reflects the daily herding and traveling within the reservation after the federal policies of 1868. In 1910, a young Kiowa woman experienced the practices and traditions of her people. Kiowa communities occupied the Great Plains in nomadic bands. Among their tasks, young people gathered roots and fruits, crafted pouches and leather utensils, and cared for children, ensuring the transmission of knowledge and rituals. Josephine Sarah Marcus and Wyatt Earp appear side by side at the Happy Days mine, a prospecting operation they maintained after their time in Tombstone. The photo was taken around 1920, across from Parker, Arizona, at the foot of the Whipple Mountains, where the couple, already famous for the 1881 events at the OK Corral, pursued a new source of income during the late gold boom of the Southwest. Josefa Rios, born in the community of Sells in Tohono O'odham territory, devoted herself in the 1920s to the oral documentation of traditional myths and songs, the organization of annual cultural learning gatherings, and the teaching of craft techniques. She acted as an interlocutor between elders and researchers, recording ceremonial practices and ensuring the continuity of her people's knowledge amid social transformations. In 1908, two Apsaluk riders, called Crow by the colonizers, pose in front of their tipi, set up among snow-covered conifers on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains in Montana. The photograph, taken during the reservation era, shows the persistence of winter nomadic ways of life, despite federal sedentarization policies and the assimilation efforts imposed by the United States government. In 1892, a young Kiowa woman living on the southern Kansas reservation wore traditional ceremonial attire with beads and leather fringes, evidencing the persistence of her people's rituals and cultural symbols. Calamity Jane, born Martha Jane Canary, registered in Deadwood, Dakota Territory around 1876, at a time when she served as an Army courier and civilian guide on the route to the Black Hills gold fields, a few months after the murder of Wild Bill Hickok, her saloon and traveling partner. President Theodore Roosevelt, on an official visit to California in May 1903, stands with naturalist John Muir on the Glacier Point overlook in Yosemite Valley. Their conversation during this three-day journey through the park strengthened the federal policy of preserving public lands in the United States. Juanita Buck, a member of the Dakota Sioux Nation established along the Minnesota River, distinguished herself in the 1880s by preserving traditional rituals, passing oral narratives to new generations, and adapting ancestral practices in the face of federal authorities' impositions. Dick Brewer was a lawman and cattle foreman in Lincoln County, New Mexico. In 1878, during the Lincoln County War, he led the Regulators, a legally deputized posse that included Billy the Kid, organized after the murder of rancher John Tunstall. In the Blazers Mill shootout, Buckshot Roberts killed Brewer. In 1910, the photographic record of Goldie Jamison Conklin, a member of the Seneca Nation on the Allegheny Reservation, shows her wearing her ceremonial clothing, an embroidered tunic, beaded necklace, and feather ornaments, elements that reflect her people's rights, tribal affiliation, and traditions. A photo of Wyatt Earp, taken in 1923 when the former sheriff, then 75, lived in Los Angeles and advised movie studios on the first Old West scripts. already a national legend for the 1881 shootout at the OK Corral. He was then trying to ensure that the story preserved his reputation and brought him profit at a time when the pioneer frontier had become a memory. A photograph shows a member of the Umatilla tribe, identified as a hereditary princess, during a ceremony on the banks of the Columbia River in northeastern Oregon. Major Lee Morehouse captured this scene in August 1900 during his studies of local indigenous communities. Millie Ringgold, born enslaved in the American South, migrated to Yogo Creek, Montana shortly after emancipation, drawn by the 1879 gold rush. She worked as an independent prospector and, with her earnings, opened a boarding house that welcomed black miners and travelers, a rare example of African-American female-owned property on the frontier. Around 1876 in Ford County, Kansas, Bartholomew Bat Masterson, 23, and Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp, 28, posed shortly after being appointed deputy sheriffs. Their patrols in Dodge City, then the endpoint of the Texas Cattle Trail, symbolized the effort to enforce the law on a frontier marked by clashes among cowboys, buffalo hunters, and freight haulers. A 1912 image shows a dying Navajo woman with 2 small children and a dog at a camp near Winslow in northern Arizona. The photo captures the pastoral daily life of Navajo families on the eve of the railroad's completion, which would expand the wool and craft trade after the 48th American state was established. Interior of the bar at the famous Gem Theater, the heart of nightlife in Deadwood, Dakota Territory in 1880. Imported bottles await miners coming from the Homestake mines. On the right stands Al Swearingen, a key figure in the local underworld who ran drinks, gambling, and the brothel on the upper floors. The scene captures the excitement, easy profit, and violence typical of towns born from the gold rush. The chief's daughter presents Latiquilla Tede, a young woman from the Pueblo community of New Mexico, photographed in 1905 by Carl Moon during his ethnographic expedition to the American Southwest. The image records ceremonial garments and a reserved posture, reflecting ancestral practices and serving as a document of early 20th century indigenous cultural exchange. A camp wagon known as a chuck wagon, parked at the edge of a rodeo arena in Texas around 1900. This basic vehicle for the long cattle drives of the post-Civil War era served as a traveling kitchen and support point for cowboys, illustrating the shift from ranch work to the public spectacle of early 20th century rodeos. In 1910, a young woman of the Kalispel tribe called Pondorai by colonizers illustrates an indigenous community that, since before the treaties of 1855, lived along the Pend Oreille and Spokane rivers, sustaining itself with salmon fishing and root gathering in territories now located in northern Idaho and eastern Washington. A studio portrait taken around 1897 depicting Jimmy Sequent, a representative of the northern Shoshone, during a visit to Pocatello, Idaho. The photograph, produced in a typical commercial setting on the railroad frontier, captures a time when indigenous leaders sought to assert identity and negotiate rights amid federal pressures after the Plains Wars. The photograph, dated approximately 1904, records a woman of the Navajo Nation in the American Southwest. Her serene expression and slight smile, spontaneous and unposed, highlight the cultural stance and symbolic value attributed to indigenous representation at that time, giving the image an essential documentary role for ethnographic studies. James P. Beckworth, 1860, African-American explorer of the West, fur trapper and interpreter who lived many years among the Apsaluk, Crow people. After joining expeditions in the Green and Arkansas valleys, in 1846 he founded the trading post that gave rise to Pueblo, Colorado, and later guided caravans along the trail that today bears his name through the Sierra Nevada to California. In 1899, Seattle welcomed LaRoche, a young man of the Yakama Nation recognized for his participation in public ceremonies and display of traditional crafts. The son of tribal elders, He acted at civic meetings as an intermediary between settlers and Yakima, consolidating his influence in local society. Men gathered in a tavern in Southern California around 1890. On the table, glasses of craft beer and playing cards go around, a common pastime for railroad workers and farmers who, after the gold rush boom ended, began meeting in these wooden establishments to discuss orange prices, local politics, and news of the new Southern Pacific branch. Death Valley. In the 1870s, after the discovery of borax in the dried Furnace Creek beds, mining companies formed convoys of 2 10-ton wagons, driven by a driver and an assistant, pulled by 20 mules and sometimes 2 horses. The nearly 270-kilometer trip to the Mojave Rail Junction, under extreme heat, brought the ore into the Pacific industrial networks and popularized the legendary 20-mule team. Photo of the first house built on the spot where Dodge City, Kansas stands today. The simple ranch was raised in August 1872, right after the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad reached the area. It served as a rest stop for buffalo hunters and traders traveling the old Santa Fe Trail, the initial mark of the settlement that, months later, would become known for livestock and Old West caravans. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok appears in Springfield, Missouri in 1864, at the height of the Civil War. He was then serving as a civilian scout for the Union Army, moving between camps to gather information about Confederate guerrillas harassing the Missouri-Kansas border. The city, a strategic point on supply routes, was under military occupation and in a constant state of tension. A 1908 photograph captures Awe Ayu, whose name means pretty flower in Seneca, a member of the Seneca Nation, wearing ceremonial clothing. The portrait documents ritual practices and symbols of Seneca belonging in the early 20th century. Early 1870s ethnographic accounts record that in the Uinta Ute camps, dogs were not limited to mere companionship. They pulled small travois, guarded provisions, helped in hunts, and took part in ceremonies, forming a structural part of the group's economy and ritual life. John Dunn, a handyman carpenter and self-taught photographer, takes a coffee break in front of the small cabin serving as his workshop, while in the background sits the wagon used by traveling launderers who served the growing population of Missoula, Montana, around 1900, during the expansion of railroads and logging camps in the region. A photograph from 1887, taken in the Montana Territory, shows 7 Crow Nation chiefs lined up in front of a modest wooden building next to the Indian Agency post. The image documents the diplomatic presence of these leaders during negotiations with federal representatives in the period of transition to reservations. Interior of a saloon in Prescott, Arizona, c. 1900. Men in hats gather around the long bar and pine tables while a pianist improvises ragtime. These bars worked as social centers for the mining town, serving cowboys, prospectors, and travelers in a region that would soon leave territorial status to become a state in 1912. A member of the Caddo Nation, was photographed by George Bancroft in 1906. The image documents ceremonial ornaments and ancestral symbols, evidencing ritual practices and the social organization of Caddo communities on the southeastern plains of the United States. Chung On, a Chinese merchant settled in Virginia City, Montana, around 1896. His store provided dried foods, teas, and silks to the miners who stayed on after the gold boom. The image shows the role of the Chinese community, established there since the 1860s, in supplying the frontier and maintaining ties with the Pacific, despite the anti-Chinese legal barriers in effect. During the 1907 expedition to document indigenous cultures, Edward S. Curtis photographed Lucille of the Dakota Sioux ethnicity. She wears ceremonial attire composed of mantles and bead necklaces, as well as bracelets, and her expression reflects the passage of ancestral knowledge. George W. Parsons in Tombstone, Arizona, after returning from Sonora, Mexico on January 2, 1883. Holding a law degree, he became a banker during the city's silver boom. His diary, maintained with near-daily discipline, became a primary source on the social life, armed conflicts, and frenzied economy of the Arizona Territory in the 1880s. In 1925, Wyatt Earp, the famous former sheriff of Tombstone and central figure in the OK Corral gunfight, was photographed by the Colorado River facing Arizona. The snapshot, taken during a visit to old mining areas in the Southwest, shows the Old West veteran reminiscing about the frontier he helped pacify decades earlier. In 1894, a photograph captures a smiling Kiowa woman, a document that illuminates social practices and everyday objects of this community. Taken on indigenous territory, the image details her hairstyle and clothing, providing a basis for studies of Kiowa social structures and cultural transmission at the end of the 19th century. A photo from 1893 shows a gold mine built on the slope of Cripple Creek, Colorado. The wooden buildings and the inclined plane illustrate the initial phase of the gold district launched after the 1890 discovery, when investors and workers migrated to exploit the vein, making the place the most dynamic mining center in the state until the early 20th century. A 1900 image shows a member of the Western Apache Nation, photographed in White River, in what is now the Fort Apache Reservation in eastern Arizona. The image is part of efforts by ethnographers and federal agents at the turn of the 20th century to document indigenous populations under the new reservation policies instituted by the United States government. The 1905 photograph records Kate Thunder Miner, a member of the Ho-Chunk tribe in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Standing before a simple board backdrop, she wears a checked wool shawl with fringes, reflecting both indigenous textile techniques and the regional influences of the time. An 1889 photograph shows prospector Archie Smith on the porch of his cabin near Eagle Creek, on the outskirts of Murray, Idaho. The snapshot marks the decline of the local gold rush, when small independent miners lacking heavy machinery persisted in extracting gold-bearing gravel to keep the settlement that had emerged early in the decade alive. In 1898, a glass plate recorded the portrait of a young man of the Assiniboine tribe during an expedition to the northern plains. The photograph reveals facial features, ceremonial clothing, and traditional adornments, offering a valuable visual document about their rituals and social organization. In the mid-1880s, James McCree built a sod house south of the Middle Loop River near Berwyn in Custer County, Nebraska. Such construction spread after the Homestead Act of 1862, when settlers used the turf soil due to the lack of lumber, illustrating how pioneers adapted to the arid conditions of the Great Plains. Zitkalasa, known in Lakota as Redbird, stood out in the early 20th century as a writer and advocate for indigenous rights. In autobiographies and articles in English-language newspapers, she exposed Lakota traditions and criticized assimilation policies, opening space for Native American narratives. Tombstone, Arizona, photographed by C.S. Fly, 1881, capturing Fremont Street at the height of the Silver Rush. Wooden facades, saloons, and gambling houses rise in the background, drawing miners, merchants, and gunmen. Fly, who owned the studio next to the OK Corral, documented daily life on the frontier shortly before the shootout that pitted the law against the Clantons. An image from around 1878 shows drunk men wielding rifles and revolvers, representing the improvised infantry that served the Murphy-Dolan merchants and the Tunstall-McSween block during the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. A typical frontier scene where hired guns drank whiskey before going back to the crossfire. Wyatt Earp, then about 39, had already survived the OK Corral shootout, served as a federal marshal in Tombstone, and was now roaming the Southwest in search of new silver strikes. In 1887, he was between prospecting trips and card tables, carrying the reputation of a tough lawman and the central figure who would shape the Old West narrative. Around 1900, a photograph records a woman of the Crow tribe near Sheridan, Wyoming. She wears ceremonial attire consisting of an elk-tooth tiara, a worked leather belt, and several bead necklaces. The image documents social practices and Crow cultural identity. In 1889, this scene shows the interior of the Table Bluff Hotel Saloon, a stopover for travelers following the coastal road and for loggers supplying the Humboldt County shipyards. The sturdy wooden beams, kerosene lighting, and long counter reveal the importance of the redwood trade to the local economy at the turn of the 19th century. Final record of William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, taken in Denver at his sister Mary Decker's house on January 7, 1917. He still wears a hat and a suede jacket, trademarks of the Wild West shows that spread the frontier myth. The image comes right before his death on January 10th from kidney failure and ends his public presence. Atra Ason, officially known as Bertha Thompson, was born at the start of the 20th century, the daughter of Milton James Thompson, a jurist of European descent, and Chinawa, a member of the Yurok tribe. Her name appeared in 1914 civil records in California, a document that attests not only to her family origin, but also to the systematic effort to catalog indigenous lineages at the time, demonstrating the historical value of such records for reconstructing ancestral narratives. Undated image of Oglala Lakota, Chief Irontail with Black Diamond, the male bison from the Bronx Zoo. The scene took place in 1912, when both posed for the sculptor James E. Frazier, whose buffalo nickel aimed to honor indigenous peoples and the almost extinct Plains bison. Photo of the last known gathering of the survivors of the confrontation, fought on June 25, 1876, held on June 25, 1948, at what was then the Custer Battlefield National Monument, Crow Agency, Montana. Lakota, Cheyenne veterans, and former Army Scouts reenact for the camera the outcome that sealed the defeat of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Bass Reeves, 1910, was born enslaved and freed himself after the Civil War. In 1875, he was appointed a U.S. Deputy Marshal in Indian Territory, the first black man west of the Mississippi. For 3 decades, he captured hundreds of fugitives under orders from Judge Isaac Parker, helping pacify the region later called Oklahoma. An 1887 scene, a cowboy sitting in front of the wooden facade of the BT Ranch in Missouri. In the final phase of the cattle boom, ranches like this served as stops for Texas herds arriving by rail. His brake, hat tipped down and boots covered in dust, reflects the fatigue of large cattle drives, just before fences and farms reshaped the plains. Boss Caswell's Monkey Saloon, a gathering spot for miners and railroad workers in Granite, Colorado, on the banks of the Arkansas River in the early 1880s. The establishment, humorously named, reflected the local gold camp culture and served as a center for information, commerce, and leisure during a time of rapid change in the region. A hand-colored photo portraying Bone Necklace, an Oglala Lakota chief taken around 1899, possibly in F.A. Reinhardt's studio during the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. The scene dates to the time when the Lakota Nation was confined to reservations, and federal assimilation laws forced their transition from buffalo hunters to dependence on government subsidies. In 1880, Julia Ann Keka, a member of the Umatilla tribe, was photographed in an official ethnographic session conducted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The image documents her braids, typical adornments, and clothing, reflecting the coastal traditions of the Columbia River and the changes imposed by resettlement policies of that period. Dodge City, 1878. Along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, the village was the endpoint for Texas cattle drives on the Great Western Trail. Wooden buildings stood along Front Street, filled with saloons where cowboys spent their pay. Masterson and other peace officers patrolled the night, preventing clashes between ranchers, buffalo hunters, and suppliers for nearby Fort Dodge. A photo taken by Edward S. Curtis in Montana around 1900 shows Cheyenne participants prepared for the Sundance, the annual ceremony celebrating cosmic renewal and tribal unity. The image was captured when federal policies pressured indigenous nations to abandon traditional rights, making this shot a rare visual testimony of Cheyenne cultural resistance. On a 1900 glass plate, photographed by an anonymous author, appears an unidentified Native American young woman. Wearing mantles and ceremonial accessories of her tribe, she reveals the persistence of ancestral customs amid the cultural assimilation policies of the time. The widely circulated edition of the Illustrated Police News from April 15, 1882, which featured the scene of the fatal shot on its center pages, shaped public judgment. Bob Ford was branded as the traitor who shot the famous outlaw Jesse James in the back, James then being unarmed. A studio photograph of an unknown Ute individual, produced in Denver, Colorado in 1870, when photographers in the American West sought to document indigenous leaders for ethnographic albums and to satisfy the growing interest of the urban public during the railroad expansion.